You are the great leader, statesman, sent by heaven to bring common sense and traditions, and I'm convinced that your wise and bold policy needs to be strongly supported worldwide.
Kazakhstan has just erupted. A series of people took to the streets burning Chinese flags and portraits of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping effigies and China's flag burned across Kazakhstan.
For years, Xi Jinping believed that Central Asia could be secured not through soldiers or force, but through something far cleaner on paper: money. Massive loans, infrastructure deals, and political courtesies, all stitched together into a grand vision of influence stretching across the heart of Eurasia. And on the map, everything looked perfect. Beijing's strategists imagined a region seamlessly linked to China through pipelines, highways, and investment corridors. But maps never show what simmers beneath the surface. That illusion collapsed in November 2025. In the narrow back streets of Almaty, a single act of defiance ignited a political wildfire. Flames rose around a burning portrait of Xi Jinping, not as a routine protest, but as a symbolic rupture of something Beijing had taken for granted: silence. What unfolded in those streets was the moment China's Central Asia strategy encountered its greatest barrier: not a foreign government, not rival powers, but ordinary citizens who felt cornered on their own land. To the architects of China's foreign policy, the Belt and Road Initiative was a gesture of cooperation. To many Kazakh citizens, it appeared as something far more intrusive: a slow, quiet encroachment into their territory, identity, and autonomy. For years, their concerns simmered. On that night, they boiled over. But this story does not end with a burning portrait. It expands across borders, straight to the Kazakhstan-Russia frontier, where long lines of halted trucks stretch for tens of kilometers under the winter sky. At the same moment, anger erupted in Almaty. Kazakhstan's border crossings froze. Commerce halted. Trade routes stalled. And two major powers, Russia and China, found themselves unexpectedly dependent on Astana's next move. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, long viewed as a careful balancer between East and West, had shifted. Far from Moscow and Beijing's expectations, he was sitting at negotiating tables in Washington, securing multi-billion-dollar deals that would reshape the region's trajectory. And to understand how these events are connected, the protests, the border shutdown, the diplomatic maneuvering, we must look deeper into Kazakhstan's geography, its political memory, and the anxieties that have haunted its population for nearly a decade. Because what the world saw in November 2025 was not an overnight explosion. It was the culmination of years of pressure, fear, and resistance. Pressure that now threatened to overturn China's trillion-dollar dream, the roots of a rebellion. China's strategy in Central Asia has rested on one defining idea: political leverage through economic dependency. The region, from Beijing's perspective, was more than a neighbor. It represented an energy reservoir, a gateway to Europe, and a buffer stabilizing China's western frontier. Billions were poured into pipelines, roads, rail hubs, and industrial projects. But underneath these grand ventures lay a deeper concern that Kazakhstan could not ignore. Beijing proposed long-term leases of agricultural land, millions of hectares. It promised 55 large-scale industrial projects. On paper, it appeared to be economic modernization. In the eyes of many Kazakhs, it resembled a gradual surrender of their sovereignty. Local reports and academic analyses from multiple regional think tanks highlighted a growing fear that with every new factory, every loan, every leased field, China would bring its own workers, its own security forces, and eventually its own demographic presence. To activists and nationalist groups, the equation was horrifyingly simple. If you lease your land today, you may not control it tomorrow. And these concerns were not purely theoretical. News from the Xinjiang East Turkestan region, just across the border, had long raised alarm among Kazakhstan's citizens. Stories of surveillance, repression, and forced assimilation sharpened anxieties about allowing deeper Chinese influence into their own communities. The breaking point came in July. A Kazakh citizen, Alimnur Turanbay, was detained without explanation by Chinese border authorities during routine commercial transit. For many Kazakhs, this was no longer about land. It was about dignity and security. When protesters gathered in Almaty demanding Turan Bey's release, they weren't only speaking for him. They were speaking against the trajectory their nation seemed locked into. The burning portrait of Xi Jinping was not merely an act of anger. It was a declaration that the public was no longer willing to quietly accept what they viewed as an encroaching influence over their future. Yet the true twist in this story came from the Kazakh government's response. Instead of swiftly suppressing the demonstrations, instead of issuing apologies to Beijing, instead of blocking images from spreading, as many expected, Tokayev's administration allowed the anger to breathe. Yes, some protesters were detained. But the state did not crack down with the severity typically seen when Central Asian governments fear upsetting a major power. Why? Because Tokayev understood something crucial. Public anger could become a diplomatic shield. When Chinese diplomats questioned stalled projects or delayed approvals, Astana now had an answer ready. My people don't want this. I cannot push them further. It was a rare move, leveraging public sentiment to push back against a dominant regional power. But the story doesn't end there, because the protests were only half of the pressure Kazakhstan applied. The other half unfolded at the border. At the very moment the streets of Almaty lit up, Kazakhstan began executing one of the largest logistical slowdowns modern Eurasia has ever seen. Technical glitches, unusually thorough inspections, rigid enforcement of paperwork protocols. This was not chaos. It was deliberate. And it marked the place where China's overland expansion literally stopped moving. The border turns into a battlefield without guns. As anger spread in Kazakhstan's cities, something even more consequential was happening hundreds of kilometers away, quietly, methodically, and with enormous geopolitical impact. At the Nur-Zholi crossing along the China-Kazakhstan border, a line of trucks began forming. Then it grew, and grew, and grew. Soon, more than 10,000 trucks were trapped in an industrial-scale deadlock, an immovable chain of metal stretching over 30 kilometers, visible from satellite images. This was more than a traffic jam. It was the soft underbelly of the Eurasian economy being squeezed. China had envisioned this crossing as a vital artery of the Belt and Road Initiative, a channel through which goods would flow into Europe and Russia each day with clockwork precision. But the system faltered. Reports indicated that Beijing was unable to process the promised volume of vehicles on its side of the border. And Astana, instead of resolving the bottleneck, chose to deepen it. Suddenly, Kazakhstan's electronic queue system began experiencing technical malfunctions. Customs officers became extraordinarily meticulous, inspecting trucks with unprecedented scrutiny. What had once been routine became burdensome. It wasn't random. It wasn't spontaneous. It was strategy. Because Tokayev had received something that changed the equation entirely, a sanctions list from Washington. Trucks heading toward Russia began undergoing intensive checks. Authorities searched for dual-use goods, components that could be used for both commercial and military purposes. Microchips, drone engines, thermal optics, specialized electronics, items critical to Vladimir Putin's war machine. Several reports from the region described how sensitive cargo, often rerouted through Central Asia to bypass Western controls, was now caught in a vice. For Russia, the consequences were immediate and painful. After Western automakers left the Russian market, Chinese vehicles became the primary alternative. But now thousands of these cars, along with crucial spare parts, were stuck in the Kazakh steppe under layers of frost and snow. Dealers in Russian cities reported shrinking inventories. Black market prices soared. The Kremlin could do little more than watch the disruption unfold. But the damage wasn't limited to Russia. China also felt the blow. Every hour the trucks sat still, Chinese exporters lost millions in delayed deliveries and contractual penalties. And perhaps most damaging of all, European partners began reevaluating the reliability of the Belt and Road Initiative. Because what good is a trade corridor if a single country, Kazakhstan, can choke it at will? Tokayev had proven a critical point. He controlled the tap. The Belt and Road was not secured by loans or agreements. It depended on Kazakhstan's willingness. And right now, that willingness was in question. This was no longer a logistical slowdown. It was a geopolitical pressure device, one that neither Moscow nor Beijing had expected Astana to wield so boldly. But the question remained, where did this confidence come from? What gave a mid-sized nation, wedged between two powerful neighbors, the courage to enforce such a dramatic shift? For that answer, we must look far beyond Eurasia. A quiet deal in Washington changes everything. While Kazakh streets were erupting and border lines were freezing over, a profoundly important meeting was happening thousands of miles away, inside the Oval Office of the White House. President Tokayev had traveled to Washington for a landmark diplomatic engagement, the C5+1 summit, bringing together leaders of Central Asia with the United States. But this was not a ceremonial visit. It was a negotiation that would reshape the regional balance of power. According to multiple regional reports and official summaries, Tokayev met with U.S. President Donald Trump or senior members of his administration. The message from Washington was unmistakably clear. Don't fear Russian pressure. Don't rely on China's money. We will support your independence. The United States offered Kazakhstan a major investment package worth $17 billion, covering energy infrastructure, rare earth extraction, logistics, and high-value industrial development. But money was only one part of the equation. The real offer was political security. Washington wanted Kazakhstan to enforce sanctions against Russia, curb the flow of sensitive goods headed to Moscow, place tighter controls on Chinese expansion, and serve as a stabilizing alternative in a region previously dominated by Russia and China. For years, Tokayev maintained a multi-vector foreign policy, balancing carefully between all sides. But in Washington, that balance shifted. He wasn't just navigating between powers. He was choosing new priorities. For the U.S., Kazakhstan represented a strategic opportunity. If Russia could be pressured militarily in Ukraine, it could also be pressured economically in Central Asia. Kazakhstan, sitting at the crossroads of Eurasian trade, was the perfect leverage point. For China, the implications were profound. A Kazakhstan supported by the U.S. meant the Belt and Road Central Corridor could be slowed, blocked, or redirected at any moment. And Tokayev was fully aware of the weight of the moment. By the time he returned to Kazakhstan, public anger against China was rising, the border crisis was escalating, and Washington's guarantees were quietly in his pocket. That combination, public legitimacy at home and diplomatic backing abroad, gave him unprecedented room to maneuver. This is why Kazakhstan felt confident enough to resist pressure from both Moscow and Beijing simultaneously. And it explains why the government did not suppress the protests in Almaty with the usual urgency. Letting public frustration surface gave Tokayev leverage he could use in negotiations. Kazakhstan, long seen as a predictable and cautious partner, had become an unpredictable force, one capable of reshaping trade flows, diplomatic alignments, and regional stability. With the foundations laid and the geopolitical map shifting, the next chapters reveal how the crisis escalated further, and why the events of 2025 are not simply a regional conflict, but a turning point for Eurasia as a whole. Land, identity, and a decade of unresolved tension. To understand why Kazakhstan's population reacted so fiercely in 2025, we must go back nearly a decade, long before the flames in Almaty, long before the border crisis, and long before Tokayev's Washington visit. The roots of this unrest lie in a single, deeply emotional issue: land. In 2016, the Kazakh government announced a reform allowing foreign companies, including major Chinese agribusinesses, to lease agricultural land for up to 25 years. On paper, it was a strategy to boost the economy and modernize rural infrastructure. But the public saw something very different. To many Kazakhs, land is more than territory. It is heritage, cultural survival, and sovereignty. The idea of foreign companies managing millions of hectares triggered a fierce national response. That year, protests swept across cities from Adarau to Almaty. What began as peaceful gatherings escalated into some of the largest demonstrations the nation had ever seen. Farmers, students, laborers, and activists united under one message: our land is not for sale. Under immense pressure, The government suspended the land reform and declared a moratorium. But the fear never fully disappeared. Instead, it simmered beneath the surface for years, waiting for the next spark. And China's growing presence provided one spark after another. Infrastructure loans tied to long-term commitments, expanding industrial partnerships, massive factory plans under the Belt and Road banner, concerns that Chinese companies would bring large numbers of workers. Then came the 55 Factories Initiative in 2019, a sweeping industrial plan intended to reshape Kazakhstan's manufacturing sector. Again, resistance erupted. Locals feared environmental hazards, demographic shifts, and greater dependency on China. Protesters chanted, "Fix our old factories. We don't want China's new ones." Every cycle of investment produced a parallel cycle of suspicion. Every new project reignited old fears. This tension was amplified by events across the border in Xinjiang. Reports of repression, surveillance, and forced assimilation made many Kazakhs nervous about allowing China's political influence any foothold on their land. So when Kazakh citizen Alimnur Turanbay was detained by Chinese border guards in 2025, it wasn't just a legal issue. It triggered a feeling that had been building for almost a decade. First they want our land, now they are taking our people. For thousands of citizens, this was the moment that everything coalesced into a single narrative of threat. And Tokayev's government, instead of crushing this wave of emotion, strategically allowed it to rise. Public anger became a tool the state could use. When Beijing asked why certain projects were stalled, Tokayev could now point to the streets and say, "My people reject these factories and land deals. I cannot push ahead." This dynamic created something unprecedented in Central Asia, a leader using internal protest pressure as diplomatic leverage against two major powers. But the geopolitical tension was just beginning. Because Kazakhstan's resistance, both from the people and the state, created shockwaves not only in Beijing, but in Moscow. And Russia's reaction would reveal just how fragile its influence in Central Asia had become. The fall of old alliances and the rise of a new power balance. For decades, Russia considered Kazakhstan one of its most reliable partners, part of its historical sphere of influence, bound by security agreements and economic ties. But by 2025, that assumption had eroded to its core. While Putin grappled with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russia's ability to project power elsewhere had diminished dramatically. Troop deployments, economic capacity, and political bandwidth were stretched thin. This created a vacuum, and Kazakhstan moved into it with unexpected confidence. The shift was sharpest within the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, the Moscow-led military alliance intended to protect member states. Kazakhstan's warming ties with Washington, combined with its refusal to suppress anti-China protests, signaled a major departure from Moscow's expectations. Analysts describe the situation bluntly. Russia was losing its closest Central Asian partner. For the Kremlin, the border crisis was a humiliation. Russian factories desperately needed components flowing through Kazakhstan. Automotive and machinery sectors were struggling under sanctions, and Chinese imports were a crucial lifeline. But instead of speeding up shipments to help Russia, Kazakhstan slowed everything down. Tokayev was now enforcing Western sanctions far more tightly than Moscow expected. He oversaw thorough inspections of trucks, halted suspicious dual-use cargo, and created weeks-long delays for goods heading into Russia. The consequences inside Russia were immediate. Vehicle supplies crumbled, spare parts vanished, prices skyrocketed, factories reduced production, logistics networks became unpredictable. And all of this was happening because a country Russia once viewed as compliant was now openly acting against its interests. From Beijing's perspective, the pivot was equally alarming. China had believed it could secure Kazakhstan through investment, loans, and long-term industrial planning. But Tokayev's visit to Washington proved that money could not guarantee political loyalty. China's alternative trade route, the middle corridor through the Caspian Sea, now depended on a Kazakhstan increasingly aligned with the United States. This threatened the viability of the Belt and Road's Eurasian component. It was a checkmate neither Moscow nor Beijing had anticipated, The dragon and the bear, China and Russia, now found themselves in a rare moment of shared vulnerability. Both needed Kazakhstan. Both expected compliance. Both discovered they no longer had it. And at the center of this dramatic shift stood Tokayev, backed by an angry population at home and new assurances abroad. But the crisis wasn't finished. Its consequences were now spreading beyond borders, reshaping trade routes, military alliances, economic systems, and national identities across the region. What comes next may redefine Eurasia's future. A region reshaped, power, pressure, and new fault lines. What unfolded in Kazakhstan was not an isolated crisis. It was a tectonic shift, reverberating across the entire Eurasian landmass. For years, China and Russia had cultivated a shared expectation that Kazakhstan's government would remain predictable, aligned, and cautious. But the events of late 2025 shattered that assumption. Kazakhstan had done something rare in geopolitics, something small and mid-sized nations are often told they cannot do. It changed the rules of engagement. By weaponizing logistics, public sentiment, and diplomatic timing, Kazakhstan turned its geographic position into a strategic fulcrum. This new assertiveness began reshaping the region in several profound ways. 1. The Middle Corridor's uncertain future. China's vision for the Belt and Road Initiative depended heavily on the overland route that passed through Kazakhstan. If goods could not move across Kazakh territory efficiently, the entire system slowed down. European companies began questioning the reliability of Chinese shipments. Some logistics operators even paused planned expansions along the corridor. Kazakhstan had demonstrated that it could freeze a trade route worth billions, and that realization alone sent shockwaves through Beijing's economic planning circles. 2. Russia's strategic isolation. Deepens already strained by the war in Ukraine, Russia relied on Central Asia to maintain economic stability. But Kazakhstan's increasingly strict enforcement of sanctions meant that Moscow's alternate supply chains were collapsing. Factories halted production. Automotive markets shrank. Importers turned desperate. And the Kremlin realized that its influence in the region was no longer guaranteed. 3. The rise of a new balancer in Eurasia. For the first time in years, the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia was no longer dictated primarily by Russia and China. Kazakhstan had emerged as a player capable of tilting the balance toward whichever partner best served its national interests. And with Washington's recent guarantees, Astana now had a counterweight powerful enough to resist pressure from either neighbor. These consequences rippled into Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan as well. Other Central Asian governments began reevaluating their strategies, their alliances, and their vulnerabilities. What Kazakhstan demonstrated was simple and transformative. A nation located at the heart of Eurasian trade can influence global power shifts simply by deciding when trade flows and when they stop. But the internal dynamics were just as crucial as the geopolitical ones, because the true test Kazakhstan now faced was not only external pressure, but the expectations of its own people. And this brought us to another crucial layer of the crisis: the people's pressure and the leaders' gamble. Kazakhstan had never experienced a political moment quite like this one. The anger that erupted in the streets was not orchestrated, not artificial, and not manufactured. It was genuine, rooted in nearly a decade of anxiety, frustration, and fear. And Tokayev made a decision few leaders in similar circumstances would dare to make. He chose not to suppress it. He allowed it to grow. He allowed it to be seen. He allowed it to influence foreign policy. This was a political gamble with enormous stakes. On one hand, letting the protests breathe gave Tokayev legitimacy when negotiating with China. He could point to the crowds and say the state's hands were tied. On the other hand, giving people space to express such strong nationalist sentiment risked fueling expectations he might later struggle to contain. But Tokayev calculated that this moment aligned perfectly with Kazakhstan's strategic pivot. With Washington's guarantees, Astana could take a harder line against China and Russia without risking immediate retaliation. And with the public's support, Tokayev could argue that resisting external pressure was a matter of national integrity. The government's message, subtle but unmistakable, was, "We are acting in the national interest because the people demand it." This strengthened Tokayev's position domestically and internationally. But it also introduced a new dynamic into Kazakh politics, a population that had tasted the power of its own voice. The burning portrait of Xi Jinping was not only a message to Beijing, it was a message to Astana. It said, "We expect you to protect our land, our people, and our future." This set the stage for a deeper transformation, one that would affect not just foreign policy, but Kazakhstan's internal political trajectory. Because once people realize their voice can steer the actions of their leaders, they rarely forget it. The Eurasian chessboard flips. By the time winter gripped the Kazakh steppe, the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia had been rewritten in real time. China believed it could secure Central Asia with investments and long-term development deals. Russia believed its historical ties and security agreements would guarantee loyalty. But Kazakhstan proved both assumptions flawed. The crisis that erupted in late 2025 revealed something neither Beijing nor Moscow had fully understood. Kazakhstan was not a passive actor. It was a pivot point, and it had decided to pivot. The burning portrait in Almaty symbolized a deeper fracture, a rejection of external dominance, regardless of whether it came wrapped in loans or legacy. For China, the message was sobering. The Belt and Road Initiative, often portrayed as an unstoppable global infrastructure project, was vulnerable to political moods, public opinion, and national pride. A single country, located at the heart of the route, could turn the new Silk Road into a dead end. For Russia, the implications were equally severe. The CSTO, once seen as Moscow's strongest regional holding, had lost its stability. Kazakhstan's drift toward Washington signaled that the Kremlin no longer commanded the loyalty it once took for granted. Kazakhstan had effectively shown that economic corridors could be paused, redirected, or reshaped according to its own national priorities. But while Russia and China grappled with these unprecedented setbacks, Kazakhstan was experiencing something entirely different: confidence. Tokayev had strengthened his domestic position by responding to public anger without crushing it. He had secured foreign support from Washington at a crucial time, and he had shown that Kazakhstan could leverage geography as power. Yet this newfound agency came with risks. Both Russia and China were now recalculating their strategies. Would they pressure Kazakhstan economically? Attempt to influence internal politics? Seek new partners to bypass Kazakh territory? Or would they attempt to rebuild trust and re-engage diplomatically? None of these questions had immediate answers. But one thing was clear: the Eurasian balance of power would never be the same again. The road ahead. Uncertainty, power, and a new era. The silence of the 10,000 trucks stuck at the border acted as a metaphor for something far larger. It represented a frozen moment in history, where the ambitions of great powers collided with the will of a nation that refused to be overshadowed. Kazakhstan had demonstrated that even in a world dominated by giants, strategic geography and public unity can reshape the course of events. It reminded the world that influence cannot be bought indefinitely, and that loyalty cannot be rented with loans. China's trillion-dollar Silk Road dream hit a wall of resistance it had not anticipated. Russia's regional dominance eroded as it struggled with war, sanctions, and shrinking leverage. And the United States, sensing an opportunity, stepped into the vacuum with offers Kazakhstan had never previously been in a position to accept. The question now is simple and unsettling. How will Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin respond to being cornered? Will they attempt economic retaliation, political pressure, diplomatic realignment, or even covert attempts to shift Kazakhstan's internal dynamics? Or is this the moment when Kazakhstan's new position, supported by public sentiment and Western partnerships, marks the beginning of a long-term realignment? Only time will reveal whether this crisis becomes a temporary disruption or the foundational moment of a new Eurasian order. What is certain is that the engines of those 10,000 trucks may have fallen silent, but the political engines of the region are running at maximum speed, reshaping alliances, trade routes, and the future of Central Asia. The world is watching. The stakes are rising. And Kazakhstan now stands at the center of one of the most consequential geopolitical transformations of the decade. If you want more deep dive breakdowns like this, covering global power shifts, hidden geopolitical strategies, and the stories shaping our world, make sure to subscribe to Gearhead Glam for the next investigation.